A verdant and flourishing world ripe for human flourishing. What an amazing goal. And that's the goal of development economics. How can nations evolve out of poverty into being places of prosperity and places where people are healthy, places where economies are healthy, places where people are happy, places where there is justice and equality. And what does financial, liberational, and social goals, how do they factor in to this kind of economics? So development economics is a subset of economics with much more of a social focus. And our task is to take these 10 principles that we've been looking at in the scriptures, 10 biblical principles of love and human worth, creativity, productivity, cooperation, work and rest, simplicity, redistribution, management, ownership, celebration and freedom, to take these and apply them at this macro international level. And we'll do that in this session by looking at existing development theories. We can begin with an overview from history, so a historical perspective, a historical anthropological perspective. We'll look at bands, so small bands of wandering people in forests, to tribes which are bigger, multi-dimensioned, reaching up to thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, but still somewhat mobile, and slash and burn economies. And then you move to a peasant economy where people settle and plant fields and crops. From that, then the progression to the urban cities, towns first and then cities. And urban means civilization, cities mean civilizations. In the valleys, the Mesopotamian Valley, the Chinese Ganges Valley. From that then to the modern cities, beginning in the 16th century on. And beyond the city, the postmodern megacity or megalopolis or urban corridor. All of these have distinctive economic production, leadership and decision-making, technology, religious patterns, cultures. We then want to reflect on that in the light of the reign of the kingdom of God. How do each of these social structures, economic structures, compare with the beautiful picture in Revelations 21-22 of the city of God? So there's a question in that historical spread, the 6,000-7,000 years of written history, and beyond that maybe more, 10,000-40,000 of human history. What is the progression leading to? So we speak of development. Where are we going with development? And then we have theories of where we're going. So Marx and Engels took their foundations. Marx took the foundation of Christianity and converted it into something else which we know as communism. And that has certain elements in terms of his economic theories. We have capitalism, which again, largely thanks to The Wealth of the Nations by Adam Smith, has been defined and categorized and rethought over the decades and centuries. And democracy is foundational to effective capitalism. Democratic capitalism underlies the different capitalisms around the world. In between, we have global socialism, which is based on capital production, but is a socialized dynamic of a capitalist system. It's not the same as Marxism, quite distinct in terms of its understanding economically. And all of these three analyses and prophecies of what is and could be, we need to compare with the kingdom of God. So the history of development economics really begins with mercantilism in the 17th and 18th century, where a nation's prosperity depends on its supply of capital from exports and imports, and whoever gets the most gold wins. And then we have different major theories that develop. Every 20, 25 years, every decade, another theory comes up, and all of these theories now coexist and are in conflict with each other. It's important to know them, so as people are talking about development, you can reflect from appropriate perspectives. So the mercantilism then became the European march across the earth to develop empires, and the civilizing of nations by these European empires, and hence economic nationalism occurring. And then with World War II, the collapse of Europe into a massive war which enabled the nations to become liberated around the world. So you've got this wave of nationalism resulting in free nations and colonialism becoming post-colonialism. And then the Europeans remaining with responsibilities for the nations and exploitation of the nations, both. And into that, Rostow came. I've got a book here by Rostow. It looks old because his theory is pretty old. Stages of Economic Growth, a non-communist manifesto. So he's opposing communism by identifying 5 stages of growth. And then that didn't really work. So then people said, but you've got to have more than stages of growth. You've got to have structural change. So you get structural change theories. Meanwhile, the Marxists come back with saying, but the peoples are poor, the nations are poor, because they're dependent on these European colonizers. So dependency theory talks of how the nations are locked into structural formation such that they can never get out of being dependent. Their wealth constantly goes to Europe or Japan more recently. A flip side of that idea was dualism, the rich countries and the poor countries, and then within nations, duality within nations, and we can look at it as duality within cities, between the elites and the ruling classes and the poor. Another version of that came from Latin America, marginality, which focused more on power structures. And then you've got within capitalism a switch in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, say, oh, we've got to go back to Adam Smith, the invisible hand, let's get rid of government intervention, and this will enable the nations to be free. Well, there's always a case for limiting government intervention and for consistently dropping off bureaucracies and laws. But this essentially was shifted from those US and UK into the World Bank, United Nations related World Trade Organization, and collapsed the economies of some nations as being inappropriate, and that leads to another set of theories about the appropriateness of development experts. So I want to go through each of these a little bit more. Linear stages theory, I've mentioned Rostow, and the idea of development of growth where they really had no plan as to how to do that. And so he took the Marshall Plan, which the US, after the Second World War, instead of destroying the German economy, the US followed a process of reconciliation with Germany and Japan and rebuilt their economies by investing money. And so taking that model, he said, well, traditional societies move to a precondition by savings. They get to a certain level of savings, it's a precondition to take off. And then they begin to take off where one sector of the economy begins to produce, and that draws the next sectors. And so sector by sector begin to become productive in terms of industrial production. So inherent in it is the idea of industry, which implies cities. Industrialization means urbanization, and the urbanization produces goods, which flows into globalization. And then it gets to a point of takeoff where you've got enough sectors so the economy begins to take off on its own and drives to a maturity where people have sufficient. Beyond that, there's mass consumption. We know from some of the other studies that happiness is at around about the range of $10,000. If you have more than $10,000 income in most countries, you don't get any happier. Up to that point, increasing income does make people happier. So the linear stages theory of Rostow. Developed countries had already passed through these stages, so why not just apply those stages to the developing world? The Harrod-Domar growth model took his ideas and put it into a series of equations and graphs. Economists love graphs. And essentially, to grow an economy, you have to have a labor force, they have to grow, there has to be technological process, and you have to have savings. And the savings rate has to be about 15 to 20% in order to get to this takeoff stage. Some problems with this: basically, most countries can't save, poor countries can't save at that rate. So the answer to that was then to bring in outside development money to get this process moving. That answer didn't work real well, and so then people realized that Europe was able to make the break because of certain structural, institutional, and attitudinal conditions. So move to the second topic here, structural change. So we're looking at biblical principles, and so if you look at that first section I've just said, the principle of savings, part of our management principle, is very strong. Cooperative processes to enable savings is in there, but then the realization is that management is essential. Certain structures are needed in order to enable savings. So structural change. You've got to have capital accumulation plus changes in economic structures, and then you have to deal with constraints. Security must be there. Very difficult for the Yazidi people in Iraq, who have been invaded 80 times over the last decades, to start businesses. Nobody is motivated because what will happen the next time they're invaded? You have to have security before you can actually get certain institutional structures. And Max Weber, that I've mentioned, he identifies in the European countries the progression of structures. Now the World Trade Organization, the UN, and UN Habitat have all worked to identify the progressions which structures need to be in place. Inherent in the thinking is that democracy is critical for stability, but is very, very difficult to develop in most contexts. And we'll come a bit later to the religious foundations, but unless you have certain value systems, it's very difficult to make these progressions. However, there has to be a shift from agriculture to industrial production, steady accumulation of physical and human capital, and then a change in consumer demand. And as these happen, you have to have an educational base, you have to increase health care. So the missionaries had come and done that around the world. Basically, they'd brought the healthcare systems with them. And as people, and they brought education, as people get educated, families decrease in size, and this facilitates savings. All right, then we move to dependency theories. So the biblical principle is against usury. But if one nation puts another nation in debt, how does that nation ever get out of debt if the ruling nation, not ruling politically, but ruling in terms of economic structures, the banking systems, if that ruling nation exports industrial goods to the dependent nation, which produces mostly agricultural goods to pay for the industrial goods increase exponentially in cost. The agricultural goods can increase about 3% per year maximum. They can never pay off their debt. And so most nations are in a continual cycle of debt. The debt of the Philippines to the US is equivalent to all that they spend on education every year. And the US will not let go of that debt to enable the Philippines to essentially become economically free. So the scriptures teach us to set people free. How do we then work against dependency so that nations are liberated and set free? Is a strategic question, a biblical question, a theological question. And the Marxists, they have a response, which is revolution. But one of the popes, Pope Paul II, people teach he's pretty good on most social issues. Maybe we wouldn't agree on some issues theologically, but on social issues often they're beautiful statements, and he speaks of the destruction of the fabric of a society that's caused by revolution, by violent change. This is not an option, generally, for us as Christians. We may be forced to defend ourselves, but we don't seek to create violence. So how then do we set people free? So I've mentioned Jane Jacobs. Her solution is that nations trade with equivalent nations. If Malaysia and Philippines trade and Thailand at equivalent levels to each other in the same region, Southeast Asia, then they can break the dependency on Malaysia, on Britain, the Philippines on the US. They can break these dependencies and hence become uplifted. So this dependency theory, it keeps reoccurring. Recently it's shifted across into theology. 50 years later, theology usually catches up with talk of post-colonial theology, which is in somewhat contrast to a Franciscan approach which seeks peacemaking. So you've got this neo-colonial dependency, and within it there is the problem of the elites selling out their countries. So the ruling class, the landlords, the entrepreneurs, the military rulers, the merchants, the public officials can make money by dealing with the colonial powers. They're intermediaries, they get roles, they get good money from those roles by negotiating deals. So it's in their interest to perpetuate the capitalist system of inequality. This is also based on the international division of labor. So capitalism has always planted factories in places like Calcutta to make clothing, to make cotton clothing, in these massive factories that employ cheap labor. It's always been the nature of global capitalism, and that continues to spread across the globe today with the exploitation of workers in the poorer countries and the marketing of goods into the richer countries. Now, just as an aside, there's the idea of a false paradigm model, where faulty and inappropriate advice from international development experts continues to extend this kind of pattern. And governments know the experts will come from the World Bank, from the World Trade Organization. They will advise the government, advise the elites what to do in order to sustain the existing economic order rather than to transform it. Okay, now I've mentioned dualism and the international structure of the duality between the elite nations, the richer nations, the 20 OECD nations, coexisting with the developing nations, and then you've got a group of collapsed nations at the bottom. You've got an interesting dynamic of the Asian dragons, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Bangkok, how they've come up from being developing to being developed nations, and then the BRICS, China and India, Brazil, how they have become now at a level similar to the developed nations. So there are changes, and there is increasing prosperity around the world for many people. So it's not a fixed concept, it's a variable concept. It's also a concept inside a country. So the GDP can move up, but the percentage of the poor may not change dramatically. The middle class are moving up, but the poor are not benefiting from this. Or as has happened with the US over the last 20 years, the elite have increased their wealth dramatically, while the poor have become poorer within the US. Significant percentage of the poor, the bottom 30%, have become poorer. So these are not temporary changes of economies. These are chronic, institutionalized relationships economically. And the differentiation continues to increase globally between the rich and the poor. And I have listed here 15 factors that can affect this. So you can look through those factors in your notes. And we can talk of the Gini coefficient, which is an analysis, a way of analyzing the relationship of the top 20% with the bottom 20% of a culture, and compare the Gini coefficient between nations to see the level of equality, economic equality within a nation. And it's very clear when you look at these that the wealthier nations have a much less differentiation between the richer and the poorer 20%. You can do the same with urban cultures. So let me move on from that to the neoclassical counter-revolution. And here you're dealing with a double whammy. You're dealing with the expansion of bureaucracy as nations move up and wealth flows in. So the bureaucracy increases. That does not imply a greater efficiency for a nation, but without it increasing, you don't get increased efficiency, increased production. So you have to expand the bureaucracy, but it can also become very corrupted. Similarly, in places such as the center of empire, such as Calcutta used to be, or in Latin America, Lima, Peru, you have the historical bloated bureaucracy of the empire. Then as the Spanish Empire split into 10 countries, still you have the bureaucracy there in Lima, Peru. So how do you reduce this bureaucracy is a significant question. And within Western capitalism among the OECD countries, there is the question of efficiency and to what extent should a government expand. It's very clear over the last century that the expansion of government has been beneficial for the economies of the developed nations. But at what point does that expansion become inefficient, counterproductive? So the Republican approach in the US in the 1980s Reagan was to decrease the bureaucracy in the name of minimalising government, and that remains a policy. Margaret Thatcher took it to an extreme. When this was imposed on other nations, I remember even in New Zealand, mandated by the World Bank to sell our electricity system to American corporations, essentially. And when you've got a small country, you can't afford to do that. You really need one electricity system. It requires a communal, or hence governmental, operational system. Splitting it up becomes totally inefficient. And so a very fine system was destroyed. That happens in country after country, as the advice was to sell off government operational components. The only people that could afford to buy them were foreign investors, and hence the foreign investors gained control on critical structures within many countries, and the countries began to continue to decline. That's been rectified in World Bank, UN thinking, UN Development Agency thinking since that time, but still neoclassical thinking underlies the international global economic system. It's called Neo-liberalism, the idea that the free markets can define exactly everything. It doesn't jive with the realities, which does require governmental intervention, and in the West has significant governmental intervention, such as the regulation of stock markets, which are meant to be free but are highly regulated in order to function without exploitation. So market friendly is a great cry, but has some problems, because usury is a sin and needs to be controlled. Exploitation is a sin and needs to be controlled, just as prostitution is a sin and needs to be controlled. These things, you can't eliminate them, but you can box them in. And that's part of the mandate in the scriptures in terms of managing a society. The king is to box in the sin that destroys the people, get rid of it if possible, if not to limit it, and is to create structures that facilitate the goodness of society. So we've got the free market approach, we've got the public choice approach, and you've got the market-friendly approach. So a market-friendly approach still allows for certain freedom, but still recognizes there is a need for legislation. So you can see there's lots of debate between these different theories. I'm talking here within the global capitalist system. When you talk of a Marxist system, you're talking of something different, where the state controls both the means of production, the distribution system, and determines consumption levels. Capitalism does not do that, whether it's socialist or whether it's pure capitalist or whether it's a mix, and most nations are a mix. They're based on the freedom of the market at the grassroots, but then some degree of limitations and some degree of redistribution. And we've spoken of that redistribution as being a biblical principle within the community of faith, but that can be applied at a national level as well. So we leads us to the next set of theories, which is on sustainability. And the scriptures teach of leaving an inheritance for our children and our children's children. But what's the inheritance if the economic system is based on increased growth, continual growth, taking the resources from the earth and using them till eventually, the predictions are, many of these resources run out. So that concept of development is not a sustainable concept. Hence, Schumacher wrote a book, Small is Beautiful, back in the 1960s, I believe, 70s. And the Club of Rome wrote a similar paper at that time. And so the concept of how do we create a sustainable global economy and national economies is there. And it does involve a triple bottom line. There is the necessity for businesses to survive economically. So every business has to make a profit, and every non-profit has to make a profit, not for the owners, because there are no owners of a non-profit, not for the leaders, but a profit to stay operational. You have to be viable financially. But there are other factors. There are social implications of your business, social concerns of the business that need to factor in to the definition of the nature of the business. And there are wider concerns in terms of sustainability of the society, economically and socially. So how does the business contribute to that? You can make money by setting up a casino, but it does nothing to help humanity. It actually sucks the life out of families. It's not good work, so we've talked of the nature of work. It's not good work, it's destructive work. It takes work, but it's not really truly work, it's destruction. So sustainability tends to involve indigenous funding generation concepts. These tend not to work, but the goal remains. Ultimately, our aim with the kingdom of God is not just economic development. It does include economic development, it does include sustainability, it does include transforming poverty, it does include participation by all, it does include equalization of wealth. These are all goals, but they are subsidiary to the wider goal of the kingdom of God and people recognizing his reign in every aspect of their life. So the whole culture, every nook and cranny, recognizing his reign on their economic principles, on their social principles, their political principles. And to get to that, we need to develop movements that expand the knowledge of the kingdom of God. If I cut that another way, the seventh set of theories are cultural theories. And these we might frame under our first principle of the dignity and the worth of the individual. And these cultural theories, we might start with Max Weber, where he wrote on the spirit of Protestantism. Who I've got the title wrong. He was essentially at the birthing of sociology, describing how Protestantism birthed capitalism. The values of thrift, the values of productivity, the values of discipline, the values of honesty, the sense of vocation in business are all inherent within Protestant theology. Within Catholicism, that's not true. The concept of the vocation of business was not part of Catholic teaching. The worth of the individual before God, everyone needed to go through the priest to Mary, then to Jesus, to God. The Protestants said, no, we go directly to God, so each person is of value. The priority on education within Protestantism, because everybody needed to read the scriptures. The scriptures weren't just for the priest. All of these created a set of values in Protestant Europe which catalyzed the economic growth in business. He then looked at other religions, Catholicism first, and explained why it would follow Protestantism. But he then said, but actually Confucianism would be the next countries, because there's many values in Confucianism, which is a cleansing really of Hinduism, Hindu thought. There's many values within this which are parallel to Christian values. So the Chinese cultures will also move up economically, which is what we've seen with the Chinese dragons. He also explained why Islam would not move rapidly to economic development, because there are factors in the belief system of Islam which mitigate against that. And we can look at issues of trust that are inherent within Christian cultures, that within a culture where revenge and distrust are part of the inherent religious philosophy. You can contrast these two. That would be one, for example, the nature of cities. Islamic cities is interesting when they're studied as they're built around specific family leaders and very strong, almost mafia-like leadership clusters within cities. And these do not work well in terms of developing a trusting economic system within the culture. Hagen and McClellan, they looked at psychological issues related to entrepreneurship, what we would call entrepreneurship today. They described it in terms of McClellan used the phrase N achievement. And he did over 100 global studies, had a whole team around the world on different aspects of producing an entrepreneurial society. It's very, very interesting what he developed. So then you've got another one more recent, which is Development as Freedom by Amartya Sen. Very interesting, because Jesus came preaching freedom. He came to set people free. So Amartya Sen, he develops that into a whole set of goals for development around freedom. Development is a process of expanding the real freedoms that people enjoy. There are determinants of freedom and there are barriers to freedom. So if we can increase the determinants and remove the barriers, then we can see free people, individuals. If individuals are free, then nations become free. So while not necessarily a Christian, he's actually reflecting really Jesus at that international level. So a very interesting book that dramatically affected the development community, development industry. So his determinants of freedom, social and economic arrangements, facilities for health, educational structure, political and civil rights, technological progress. So you can look at each of these in detail. And over time, it's interesting because these theories, starting with Rostow and influenced by Amartya Sen, with the UN Habitat, as they look at sustainable cities, then they can evaluate those different factors across the global cities. And for the World Bank, they can evaluate it across nations to determine which nations are at which point in the development of each of these kinds of arrangements. So it's become quite a science. The more difficult thing is the elimination of tyranny, which raises its head again and again in nations. It's kind of a craziness within the human psyche. And then what do you do in a place, places which are totally destroyed? Really, there's just no economy. What do you do? How do you get people just moving those first steps? I was looking at 3 IDPs, camps for displaced people in Somalia last night, and discussing with a brother working there. What do you do when there's nothing there? How do you lift people up? And then there are systems such as in Calcutta, the slavery, really, of the prostitutes, beginning with the temple prostitution, so it comes from a religious base. and 300,000 women essentially locked into rooms. This is a systemic social deprivation that's almost insoluble. But what can you do? How do you break the power of these? One president in the Philippines, upon being elected, sent the police in to basically wipe out the brothels throughout the whole sector of the city where they were based. Within a few months they were back. And then the neglect of public facilities. Most cities don't even have public facilities. If they do, then often there's not sufficient to sustain them. And then repression or intolerance and imprisonment of whole swathes of people. So how do you take that away? Here in the United States, where you've got a whole sector of the society, and the African American sector of society across the US, where there's been a historical barrier where businesses could occur to a certain point and not more. And that barrier, that racial barrier, has blocked them for decades, more than a century. And now there are people breaking through that barrier because institutionally the governments have step by step worked to decrease those barriers. So the repression has decreased, and eventually the objective is what the UN Habitat, here it's talking of sustainable cities. There's another document out on harmonious cities. How do you work so that all of the different cultures in a city are at a level of harmony, productivity, thriving, whether the divisions are racial, ethnic, cultural. These define our goals, and as you can see, all of these theories are grappling with these 10 principles of economics, starting with the dignity of the human being, build on the creativity and productivity of the human being to produce, looking at issues of management, savings and usury, redistribution of wealth. To what extent? How can you do that at a national level? How do you apply the Jubilee in a different culture? And each culture is different. You can't just impose a Jubilee. What does it look like to redistribute wealth? And the issue of lifestyles. If you're making money, is there a lifestyle of simplicity and sacrifice, living such that other people can be uplifted? All of these with the eventual aim of seeing people set free. The gospel, the good news, that they as individuals can receive the Spirit, and as He works with them, within them and among others, and as He works across the city, and as the city is infiltrated by the very presence of the Spirit of God and the truth of these biblical principles, so the city and the nation can become set free, not just from sins, but also from poverty, to a life that is abundant. Not just spiritually abundant, but abundant in terms of our physical bodies as well as our spiritual bodies, our communal relationships. This is the objective. This is what we're going for. And we need to dialogue the scriptures with these principles as we engage in different cultures. And so studying international development is essentially enabling you to position yourself in places where you can influence those discussions and bring the biblical principles into the public domain within nations. Some of the books I've referenced: Adam Smith, Foundations of Economics, in The Wealth of Nations, Rostow, The Stages of Economic Growth, post-World War II. Easterling talks of the white man's burden, and the foundation of the history of economics is here in The Making of Economic Society. Asian Drama is a cultural perspective, 29 Causes of Poverty, and that's extended in Culture and Prosperity by John Kay. And then the structural dynamics are looked at from a theological perspective in the Poverty of Nations. The development is freedom, Amartya Sen, we've mentioned, and then we're talking about sustainable cities within the context of sustainable economic development. So UN Habitat has many works in this area. If you want a master work on economic development, Todaro, all 800 pages, you're welcome to read it, study it, master it. They've reviewed it, developed it every 3 or 4 years for 30 years.